Let's get this party started, Bob. Okay, all right. I'd like to call to order the special meeting of the Governing Board study session. Let the record show that all board members are present. I need a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
Second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? And it looks like we have cleared the room once again.
Monica's kind of offended.
All the best people stayed. All right, Mr. Miglarino, budget process, I'm assuming that's you.
I believe it is. President Frank, members of the board, Dr. Finch. So this evening, I think the objective tonight, at least in my mind, is to get some initial input from the board as we start the process of the 2019-20 budget development process. And just as a little bit of history, we last year was the first year we actually had a budget committee, which involved certain stakeholders, and I'll show you some of that detail in the presentation. And we received some feedback from the board at the conclusion of that process. And I think the long and short of it was that there was an interest to modify some of that, but to still keep it, despite my plea to maybe beg you to to do otherwise. And it's not that we don't want the stakeholder input, don't get me wrong. It's just the hearing me talk about school finance 101, it's hard to, make that topic interesting, I think. I do my best, but we'll see.
I'm a math teacher. I don't feel bad for you.
Yeah. But one of the things that I think we heard from the feedback was that we needed to get the input from the community at large in advance of even the budget committee's work. And we used a specific tool, a national tool, in getting some feedback. We can modify that in terms of what questions that we ask the public to respond to. But I think this year we actually have good information from the budget committee work last year as a starting point for this year. And of course, the budget committee wrapped up their work long before the legislature finished their session, long before Red for Ed movement, long before many of the things that became known. So, but suffice it to say, even without knowing that level of detail, their input had some influence in the recommendation that ultimately ended up being approved by this board for the salary and benefit recommendation, which is the lion's share of the certainly our M&O, our maintenance and operation budget. So with that in mind, there is a goal. I don't know if this was changed. I know there was some discussion about goals earlier in this evening, but there is a goal, at least as I know it, to ensure that the Budget Committee seeks the Governing Board input prior to establishing financial priorities. And we've expanded that to include the community input from the feedback that the Governing Board provided us at the conclusion of the Budget Committee work effort that happened at the end of last year, going through those notes. We left, this is left over from last year, that the inclusive process of the Budget Committee itself would be for members outside of the NST or Negotiation Solutions team. Because we are going to retain the NST process as we did last year as well, and that there would be input from all stakeholders for the district. So the charge of the Budget Committee would be the same charge as last year, meaning that the committee of various stakeholders develop a recommendation of the budget priorities for the 2019-20 fiscal year. So that hasn't changed. The membership requirements, again, that they would not be a member of NST because we do have employee representation on the composition of the committee, but it would be separate from the NST folks as well. That they would have parent representation from each high school region, with a preference to make sure that each school type and configuration is represented, so that we would have somebody that represented an elementary configuration, somebody that represented a middle school configuration, and somebody that represented a high school configuration within the 5 high school regions of our district. So with that in mind, this would be the composition. I would chair the committee once again. I tried to even put my finger on my nose to indicate that somebody else could be the chair, but apparently that didn't work. So I'm happy to do that again. Again, the 5 parent representations from the 5 high school regions, a DVBLT representative, an administrator at large representative, a DVA representative, a certified staff at large representative, and a DVESPA representative. And that would make up actually, if I had this slid down here, we would have a DVEF representative, a parent organization representative, a business partner representative, and an interfaith representative. It is a challenge for the commitment of time that was part of the plan last year. It was 4 meetings, and they went from 6 to 8 o'clock in the evening. We did live stream those and archive those so that they could be referenced. We are proposing that we could minimize the meetings to 3. And what I did is I collapsed the first and second meeting, and we would do School Finance 101 and cover the Deer Valley financial overview in the first meeting. Those were 2 separate meetings last year. It still says third budget committee meeting. I should say second budget committee after I collapsed them. But what is titled their third budget committee would be the second, in which we would select budget priorities. We would follow back up with community input, and then in the third committee meeting, which is titled fourth here in error, would be that we would develop the recommendation and bring back. But different for this year, in addition to the governing board input that we wanted to receive this evening, would be that we would actually ask for the initial community-wide electronic feedback prior to the committee selecting the budget priorities that we would send back out to the committee as a whole. Again, this is from the feedback from the governing board. So I'm thinking that the first budget committee meeting, which has not yet been established, and the initial electronic feedback from the community could be happening simultaneously or in parallel with each other, because we'll be gathering that information to be able to provide to the budget committee for the second meeting, in which we would be identifying those priorities. So the first committee, or the first survey would be trying to provide some directed narrative responses from the community, some input, but within some parameters. The second, or what I've labeled here as the possible follow-up community-wide electronic feedback, would be a forced ranking. So now that we have all this information that we've captured from them on a more narrative input strategy, then we would actually say, okay, which ones of these are of the greatest importance? And it'd be helpful for us to kind of steer this to something that the governing board would consider as something that we would implement. So if there is something that I like to use the word taboo, that the board would not want to even consider, and I don't know, if we wanted to consider changing all the school buses from a color yellow to a color of purple, which we wouldn't be able to do, I don't want us to go down that road, and obviously using that for illustrative purposes. That's not even something that is being contemplated. But if there is something that we don't want to focus on, we certainly would like to know that, and that's the intent of this evening, is to be able to find out some input in trying to frame the initial input and the initial work of the budget committee once it gets formed. I do think that I did print out the recommendation from last year's budget committee, and I'm just going to highlight, again, without knowing how much we had in terms of resources, it was just like, hey, if you had to prioritize what you would do, and these are in these are in priority order. So their first thing was a meaningful salary increase, and they had some specific detail to that. They wanted us to ensure that we supported extracurricular activities. They liked the fact that we had a comprehensive offering for our students. They wanted to provide additional instructional time for students in need of academic help. They wanted to explore additional capital revenue opportunities, and I think this is going to be a good segue to looking at a strategy for potentially an election in November 2019. And then they wanted us to continue to explore efficiencies and to make sure that we, we're maximizing the taxpayer dollars. And they had several specific identified areas within that exploring efficiency. So again, not that these were necessarily prescriptive themselves, but again, just trying to establish some priorities so that those things could be part of the decisions that we ultimately make that the board decides later in the spring. So this is a great opportunity for us to be able to get some input from the governing board. As you know, I guess the first question is, I'm going to just make one last plea. Do we really want the budget committee process again? I knew the answer.
It's over. You're up.
I already bit my tongue once today, Mr. McLarino. Surely you're not asking me to bite it twice.
I would not be asking you to do that.
Thank you.
But the second question, and maybe being more serious, is are there some things that we want to make sure that are included in the process or the development of this year, especially, kind of recalling what we ended up doing last year with the budget committee. So this is a great opportunity for the board to provide that input.
I had a question. I don't have any answers for you yet, but more questions. How many questions do you think are going to be on the survey? Because I'm trying to figure out how the list then gets boiled down to putting in a priority order.
Last year we had 7 forced rankings.
And that came from
Those forced rankings came from the input of a process that we used from a national, it's a nonprofit organization that actually helps with resource alignment for education institutions. And so the budget committee selected from a host of predetermined options, and those options became the 7 that we asked for the community to provide input
Okay,
on.
thanks.
And there was quite a bit, I'm not trying to gloss over this, there was quite a bit of noise around these options. Some of them, I think the wording could have been different, and we kept the wording the same from the nonprofit organization. In hindsight, we probably should have modified some of the vernacular.
Well, I was just hoping that we wouldn't come with whatever that one was about, will you get rid of a principal if they're not doing their job or something.
The one that upset all the administrators
Well, there were some
it wasn't
questions that
really
really had nothing to
with the budget.
to do with the budget. So you guys are already going to scrub all that stuff, right?
Yeah. So from our feedback and input from the process, I don't think we're going to go through that exercise again. I think we might use a similar process, but not use their list of options, right? And so that's the option, and I'm reading it here: change school administrators where student achievement is consistently below district expectations, and that was again, I think that wasn't worded well because it did incite some emotional responses from folks. That was not the intention. And again, it was because it was prescribed that way from this nonprofit. But I think that we can come up with language that is specific to our district, more specific to our district, but same process in terms of coming up with those options. And again, the additional step this year would be asking for that narrative input, so that would help drive what those options would look like, as opposed to relying on the nonprofit organization's predetermined options.
Thank you.
Ms. Tweedy?
Okay, I guess the way I envisioned it, and I think it was one of those things where everybody pictures something in their head, and it's just not the same thing, and then when it comes back. So where I was feeling like the community input was going to be particularly beneficial is, I think, well, it was even I was listening to the candidate forum, and the discussion went something like, several of the candidates mentioned, and this is exactly where I think this needs to go. Several of the candidates were mentioning that they thought class size was a priority, and maybe reducing class sizes in particular core subjects like math. And then Miss O'Brien said, well, that's nice, and I think we all like the idea of reducing class sizes, but we can't find the money to reduce, and I'm paraphrasing, so you may have worded it different, but basically we can't afford it unless we take the money from somewhere else. And I think what happens in the budget process is we end up with 5 people up here who have ideas as to what should go first. We have district administration who has ideas as to what should go first, and we have classified and certified. And my thought with the budget committee and with the survey was to hear other perspectives as to, because sometimes when you're in something, you see it different than the people who are not in it. So for an example, we could put things on the forced priority, building new schools. We know that has an expense and impact on the M&O. We know we can't operate a new school, and we know excess capacity has a cost to us. Some people think that maybe that's outweighed because of having the convenience of a school close. Others don't. And these are just real disagreements. We heard at the suicide prevention work session, psychologists talk about the ratio, school counselors talk about the ratio. That's another priority, obviously, and we have heard parents talk about class sizes, particularly at the high schools and in maths and stuff. I want to see these things on a list and hear what people who aren't us think of them. Like if you had to rank these things, because I also would make a distinction between expanding programs and just the ones we have, maintaining the programs we have is a priority. I would also look at PD. I think there is a difference between in-state and out-state. The Excel spreadsheet you sent us, and it compared other districts, and it was the old one, not the new one. We were lower in the PD column, but we were higher in the airfare and hotel column. So I think we do have to distinguish between, and when people rank that, but then there may be needs that the district office is aware of that maybe whether the public ranks them high or low, they have to happen. If we don't find a way to address our bus problem, we're going to have students not being able to get to school next year, and that's unacceptable. We have to address that even if our community ranks it low. So I think it's finding the balance. And I think it would also help our board to be more cohesive when we looked at the budget if we actually had multiple perspectives. And if there's something else that should be ranked, I know we've talked about classified and certified, but those are the biggies. And I think because of maybe what groups we hear from the most, and you guys hear from the most, and we all have our vantage points, I guess I was really disappointed last year because I was hoping that the input maybe could just make us, I really did want to be able to look at it different from, we can us all get into our tunnel vision. And I was hoping that this would give us an opportunity to see how maybe the community sees it and how they see it for their children. And the other thing is, the only other, and I'm sorry, I won't monopolize, the survey last year did not make sense to me, Mr. Miglerino, because we were ranking things that would save money with things that would cost money. And to me, the more things we do to save money, the more things we could do that cost money. So I don't think that those things should pair together, because basically, yeah, I agree. We want to know what the public would tolerate to save money. And we have ideas, and some of the ideas are very unpopular with us, but they might be popular with with parents or vice versa. So ideas we've had that would save money, but I think that those two lists need to be separate because the more money we save, the further we could go down on the spending list. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Tweedy. Mrs. Fisher, did you have? Oh,
I hope you have the same meeting in January. However, I think my greatest concern, what happened last year, and what I had hoped for the district was to have an actual budget committee where they actually took a budget and did it. The only thing I can tell you is what I've done in the past, and that was what I was looking for, because it's what I'm accustomed to, where we took, this is how much we have, and we literally put it up on a screen, an Excel spreadsheet, and said, these are the, you look at the areas of priorities that have come from a survey, and then you play with the numbers and say, okay, well, if we do this, what's the cost? And you move the numbers around and you come up with a reasonable budget. So that at the end of that, you can have a dollar amount to turn over to what we called NST, or what we called IBN. You guys call NST. And then they negotiated a known amount to what fit for them. So that was the model I'm accustomed to, where it truly is a budget committee. You are actually moving numbers and looking for areas to save. And in that case, you do say, we're going to do this. Okay, that's going to save us this much money. All right, then we can spend it there. And you actually form a real budget with them. So it's not just community priorities. It's actually working with your community. Often you select community members who are CPAs, who are professionals, who are very aware of how to actually form a budget with you, and you have a solid budget. You put your nodes, because the finance office has certain nodes. You know what needs to be going to the various trusts. You know what needs to be put in the appropriate areas. So you take in your knowns, and then you take in what's left and actually form a budget. That's what I was looking for last year. I was very disappointed in it. Really was no different than the prior year, other than we brought people together and had a conversation. So, but I think if the board actually wants a budget committee, I would hope the board would decide together if they want a budget committee. If they just want community input, I don't know that a budget committee would even be. I don't. You can get that same information with a survey or a couple of surveys. I think our community resents when they're brought in to serve on a committee and they get to the end of the committee, because this is the complaints that I received, not just budget, on a lot of committees, is we came in, we talked a lot, we did the work, we did this, and we still had no idea what it was for. So I would hope that come January, the board would work with you to decide if they truly want a budget committee, and then help you to have a true budget committee where a budget is being formed, or if they just want community input, and then possibly think of a more community-centric way of getting just input. That's just my opinion.
thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. O'Brien.
I'd like to, I guess, piggyback maybe off of Mrs. Tweedy's comments regarding the survey and those discussions or those items that go on the list. And you did a very good job of paraphrasing what I said in the forum. And that is having those itemized things like class sizes or increased salaries, expanding programs versus possibly maintaining them. My concern, not that I don't want community input, I want to hear community input, but I want to make sure our community understands what they're selecting too, because when you say, do you want smaller class sizes, well, there's a dollar amount, right, for every tenth of a child we make a classroom smaller. In addition, just like with the salary increases, for every percent we go up or tenth of a percent. And so all of those items, I think it's not enough to say class size, smaller class sizes on a survey. That would be my concern. And then the question is, does the survey become, too complicated and too cumbersome that our community doesn't want to go through it, right? Because I don't know really how long the attention span is that folks enjoy putting into those. So I just want to be cautious that when we do this, we don't set the expectation that the community has gotten an opportunity to give their input, but because they don't have an understanding of what that smaller class size means versus extracurricular activities, that we're not listening to them. Does that make sense? I do like your idea of listing them and doing the spending versus saving and giving them some options. I just think we need to be careful as we go down that path and get that feedback.
I was just going to add to the class size. It would, if you're going to, somehow that goes on there, you're going to have to decide or put down if it's a K3, if it's 3-6, if it's middle school, if it's 9-12. Is it the classes that automatically they want to have 40 or 50 kids in the high school? Because or 40 kids, not 50, there's no room for that. But there are some classes that they want those numbers, where there's other classes that they only want 15 because they're teaching a calculus class. So I just think you say smaller class size, and that has, I mentioned 5 things, and there's much more to that. So however we get to it, I guess we'll get to it, but I want to make sure somehow that we're not not misleading, but kind of misrepresenting in a way, not purposefully. And I disagree a bit with you, Ms. Fisher, about the input from the community, because the survey guides those community members that are on the committee, and then they get to have back and forth dialogue listening to all. It's not exactly what you're talking about, but I think it's a little bit more, there's more layers to it than saying that it's just an in-person survey, because they are having meetings and going back and forth, and everybody's listening to why excuse me, they think this is important or it's not important. So they're talking to the teacher. I mean, they're all talking to each other. So the feedback comes from that whole circle. It's not it's not building the budget, but I think there's really good conversation, so people can understand maybe a little bit better what the implications of a choice are.
Sure, go ahead.
I would just like to throw this suggestion out in listening to what you two said. And I only said class size just for an example, because I think there's...
But it is because people talk about that a lot.
So would maybe a better idea, and I think we're a little bit more back to what we did last year, we do the committee, we throw out these things, like all the things we said, and if they throw back some things that are budget related, I'd put that caveat, and that would give you the ability to say, like, for example, we have class sizes, but keep in mind every student we reduce, it's this much, and then let the budget committee agree on the priorities that go on the survey, because then you could provide the extra information, and we have a cross culture of membership, so that it would possibly those things would be the things that would be ranked then by our community. Because I do really want this to just be a mechanism for some of the old arguments we've been kind of locked into. I just really like to see us all get a different perspective, and that being the parent, the community.
President Frank, if I may, the one...
Go ahead.
And if I can slide back to, I don't know if this has changed, but the one of the edicts that we were provided is that to ensure the Budget Committee seeks governing board input prior to establishing the financial priorities. We understood that to include not only the governing board input, but the community input prior to the Budget Committee. So if I've misinterpreted that, that is how we created the timeline for the initial community-wide electronic feedback, and again, more of a narrative to help form that. But if we follow the format from last year, you wouldn't see the initial community feedback, electronic feedback. You would only see what's marked as the possible follow-up community-wide feedback was the forced ranking that we did. So my question to the board is, are we looking to get the community-wide input in terms of additional ideas for the Budget Committee to consider? Or do we think that we can provide that with the work that we've done so far with last year's committee as a starting point, and obviously the knowledge that we have of how things have changed since the last time the Budget Committee was actually seated, which is back at the beginning of this calendar year?
Mrs. O'Brien?
Based on the slide you have up, I do like where the community-wide feedback is there. I think that you have a meeting that allows your members, if they want to add, if they see something glaring that we have missed or that you all have missed, or they think that it's glaring, that still gives an opportunity to be added, I would hope, to the survey, yet still gives the committee those 2 meetings to look at that feedback and the priorities that they received from the community.
And that was our intent, to be able to use last year's recommendation as kind of a starting point, to kind of, give this some context. So find out what those things that they like, and maybe some narrative options that would be in addition to just the items that I read out loud earlier. But then allow the committee to digest that in the context of developing the actual budget, the limit that we would have in terms of the available resources and the known things, and then go back out to the committee, or the community, with a forced ranking survey from all of the work that the committee would put together, and then that would develop the final recommendation from the committee at a future meeting of the committee itself.
And I think it would be interesting to compare last year to this year, because people's perceptions may have changed dramatically based on some of the political events and things that occurred last year, and the 20 by 20 plan now being in place, and those types of things. Mrs. Ordway.
I was going to say, so the survey would go out while you are teaching the basics for the committee.
That is correct.
So the second meeting you would have those results back from the survey?
Correct.
And that I like that a lot.
I also think when you do your budget, I do think providing information on the cost of reducing class sizes and the cost of increasing salaries, that's important for people to understand. And then we can publicize it so that hopefully people will tune in and really maybe try to promote it on Twitter and stuff, so people can understand when we make these decisions what they cost and why we can't make them all. But I think there is some education to be done in that area for sure.
I agree. And
So do we all agree on the basic budget development timeline that Mr. Migliorino has presented to us tonight?
I am in favor of it. I support it.
Any suggested changes
I just want to know when you're going to start.
into your microphone?
When are you going to start with? When are you starting to recruit the committee, and how is that happening?
President Frank, Ms. Tweedy, so the process that we have is we would publish that the committee was available, just shortly after this meeting on our website. We would send out an announcement of it and start to seek those that would be interested in participating. I think it might be a little optimistic to try and have the first meeting in December, but maybe try and shoot for right after the start of the calendar year. So first meeting in January, that would give us enough time to try and get enough people interested in this committee, and try and schedule the meetings in close proximity to each other, so that we would probably be finished, I would hope, by sometime before spring break. All 3 meetings.
I would suggest in terms of the surveys, because I think you did receive this feedback last year, that in a board update, send us the questions that are going to be on the survey. So if anyone has a concern or a question about it, we can send that feedback to you before the survey goes out. Or if we don't understand a question, because I know we got a lot of questions. Who wrote the survey? Well, we didn't. So I think just to keep the board in the loop, to let us, and again, that information can be sent in a board update. Here's what we're asking people on the survey. That way, if someone has a concern or a question, they can forward that to Dr. Finch prior to the survey going out to the multitudes.
I think using that same logic, you could also, because we haven't really hit, Darcy mentioned, Ms. Tweedy mentioned a couple topics, or, off the top of her head. But if you, in the next Thursday updates, or the next bit when you think about it a little bit more, maybe in the middle of the night, you wake up, what about this topic? Feel free to email it to Mr. Miglorino or myself. And don't forget to talk about X, Y, or Z, because we want to also gather from you where the landmines are. So if you say I don't know if you picked up on that when Mr. Miglorino was talking at the beginning, we don't want to go down a trail that you're not interested in. We don't want to waste the community's time or his time if X is off the list. So feel free to give us that information. That makes us better to narrow it faster. So any ideas that you have on topics, areas that you're interested in, you don't have to think of them all tonight, but keep that information flowing to the committee through myself or through Mr. Miglorino. That'll make our survey better. That'll make our process better.
Any further feedback or questions for Mr. Miglorino tonight? Ms. Tweedy? Okay, go ahead and ask your...
Did we answer everything you needed? I think in the past you guys may have been frustrated because we didn't give enough information.
I'm just looking through the notes I took. I think this gives us great direction. I appreciate the input. And I think we're trying to stay away from some volatile issues, much like the wording that was in the forced ranking from the prescribed list that we took from last year. So I didn't make that note, but I did hear you.
Okay, well, Mr. Miglorino, I'd like to thank you for being willing to chair the budget committee again, as well as...
Old.
Well, I know that, but and putting
Pretty
together
sure it
the
was
budget
always
development
gonna be him.
timeline and
It makes him feel better.
No, okay,
Not
why don't I
quite
just
sure
say
who
we
would've done
appreciate
it.
all of your hard work.
There we
that
go.
covers
There we
all
go.
of it. If there's no further questions or comments, I think I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in
Aye.
favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay.
Bye.
Meeting is adjourned at 8:40.